Hello again, I am Lucky and I am pursuing my integrated MBA in data science and artificial intelligence from IIT Mandi, and now I am back with the book Critical Thinking by Alec Fisher. Continuing from the last part, now let's start with Richard Paul and thinking about your thinking. In this section, in section 1.4 below, we review two final definitions of critical thinking which have been developed by scholars working in this field and which are important for different reasons. First is due to Richard Paul, who gave a definition of critical thinking which looks rather different from the other definitions given above. It is critical thinking is that mode of thinking about any subject, content, or problem. Okay, so critical thinking is that mode of thinking about. Okay, so let me focus. I'm making these videos just that I take out specific amount of time for reading these books because in my regular schedule, if I'm not making videos, I'm not able to take out enough time to read books like these. So I have to be focused, read those books. I'm not making these videos for views or to show someone, just for myself that okay, I have read this in this book and I learned this from that book. So, starting again, critical thinking is that mode of thinking about any subject, content, or problem in which the thinker improves the quality of his or her thinking by skillfully taking charge of structures inherent in thinking and imposing intellectual standards upon them. So, critical thinking is that mode of thinking about any subject, content, or problem in which the thinker improves his quality of his or her thinking by skillfully taking charge of the structures inherent in thinking and imposing intellectual standards upon them. This definition is interesting because it draws attention to a feature of critical thinking on which teachers and researchers in this field seem to be largely agreed that one realistic way to develop one's critical thinking ability is through thinking about one's thinking, often called metacognition, and consciously aiming to improve it by reference to same model of good thinking in that domain. Let us explain the idea with an analogy. An analogy from basketball. Some years ago, I lived in California with my family for a year, and my 11-year-old daughter wanted to learn how to play basketball. The basketball coach was at the local high school was just starting a team for 11-year-old girls, so my daughter went along. At the first session, he divided the girls into two teams, explained that the idea of the game was to pass the ball to your team members until someone from your team could get into a good position to shoot at the basket, and that the winner was the one who scored most baskets. Then he sets them to play against each other. Of course, there are many more rules, but he didn't burden the girls with these to begin with. These could come later. Naturally, this game was fairly chaotic, with all the girls chasing the ball at once and few baskets being scored, but it was great fun. After a while, the coach stopped them and said, "Well done, but if you are going to be really good basketball players, you must be able to shoot well. So now we'll practice shooting." He then showed them some of the funny and ineffective ways that they had been shooting before showing them how to shoot more skillfully. He drew attention to how he held the ball, where he looked, and how he stood, and so on. In short, he was providing them with a model for shooting well. Having shown them a good model, he then set them to practicing doing it the same way, asking them to be self conscious about how they held the ball, where they looked, and how they stood, and so on. And saying that ball and saying that they should try to do it as much like him as possible. After they had practiced shooting for a little while, he says, "Good, let's play basketball again. But this time, when you get a chance to shoot, try to do it in a way that we just practiced. Again, the girls played basketball, but this time they tried to shoot more skillfully. Some of them could do the same, and some found it difficult, but after all, this was only the beginning. I'm yawning again and again. I'm feeling sleepy, but I have to read at least 5 pages before sleeping. After a while, the coach stopped them and said, "Well done, we'll practice that more another time, but there is something else you need to learn. If you are going to be good basketball players, you need to pass the ball well. So now let's practice that." Again, he showed them some of the money ways of passing poorly, being demonstrated how to pass it fast and straight, with or without a bounce. Again, having shown them a good model, he said them practicing this in pairs. After a while, he stopped them and said, "Great, now we'll play basketball again, but this time when you get chance to pass or to shoot, pass, try to do it in the way we have just practiced, and if you get a chance to shoot, don't forget what we just practiced there too." Again the girls played, but this time they often passed better, not always of course, but they were just beginning. That was just a beginning. And they sometimes shot at the basket better than they had at first. After a while, the coach stopped them and said, "Well done, but now there is something else you need to learn to be good players. Instead of all racing around the court together, you need to be good at marking or guarding your opponents. So we'll practice this." Again, he showed them what had been happening because players from opposite teams were able to keep clear of each other, and then showed them how to prevent someone from passing a ball to another member of the team. Then he sets them in threes to practice this. What do you think? So we have question 1.4. What do you think the coach said after they had practiced this for a while? Okay, so if we use analogy from past two experiences, the coach would say, "Okay, now let's play basketball again, and this time mark the players as I told you to do. Also pass ball as I told you, and also shoot the way that I told you." I hope the analogy is reasonably clear now. Learning to improve your thinking is very similar. Just as we call all run around the basketball court playing an informal game of basketball, so we can think about all sorts of issues, but thinking about issues involves all sorts of skills, and most of us could improve these. Just as the basketball coach identified some fundamental skills for basketball, so those who have worked in the teaching thinking those who have worked in teaching thinking tradition have identified some fundamental skills for good thinking. Just as the basketball coach shows ineffective ways of, for example, shooting, then gave a good model which students can then practice before trying to use that skill in real situations. So those working in the teaching thinking tradition have identified ineffective ways of, say, making decision, and have then identified good ways of doing this which can be practiced and then used in appropriate situations whenever needed. That is the way we shall proceed in this book. Like the basketball coach, we shall identify some fundamental skills which are essential to be a good critical thinking, and we shall then show some characteristic weakness we are all inclined to display when doing these kind of thinking. After that, we shall show a good model of thinking in that way, say decision making. Then you will practice that kind of thinking, and finally you will face that whole tasks analogous to a whole basketball game in which you will need to deploy the relevant skills at the appropriate points. The results should be that we can produce better throughout and more reasonable beliefs and actions than most of us do in absence of such practices. Question 1.5. Discuss this analogy with fellow students or with friends or family. If you are reading this book on a self study basis, then answer the following questions. Explain in your own words what are the three stages of learning outlined are. So, three stages of learning: practicing, knowing what is wrong, knowing what is right, and then again practicing. Does the analogy seem to you to provide a good model for teaching a new skill? Yes. Skills which underlie critical thinking, some basic competencies. I imagine that one question you will ask is, what are the thinking skills underlying critical thinking that are analogous to the skills underlying basketball? Almost everyone who has worked in the critical thinking tradition has produced a list of thinking skills which they see as basic to critical thinking. For example, Edward Glaser listed the abilities to recognize problems, to find workable means for meeting those problems, to gather and marshal pertinent information, to recognize unstated assumptions and values, to comprehend and use language with accuracy, clarity, and discrimination, to interpret data, to appraise evidence and evaluate statements, to recognize the existence of logical relationship between propositions, to draw warranted conclusions and generalizations, to put the to test the generalizations and conclusions at which one arrives. Okay, to reconstruct one's patterns of beliefs on the judgment on the basis of wider experience, and to tender accurate judgments about specific things and qualities in the everyday life. Okay, I just got distracted. To reconstruct one's patterns of beliefs on basis of wider experience, and to render accurate judgments about specific things and qualities in everyday life. Glasser was so much influenced by Davy, who saw scientific thinking as a model of reflective thinking, and this list is probably best understood as relating especially to scientific and similar thinking. It does, however, contain many elements which belong to more recent conceptions. For more recent thinking, see Fisher and Scriven. Chapter 3 in this book, we shall deal with some of the fundamental critical thinking skills, in particular, how to identify the elements in a reasoned case, especially reasons and conclusions, identify and evaluate assumptions, clarify and interpret expressions and ideas. Okay, judge the acceptability, especially the credibility of claims, evaluate arguments of different kinds, evaluate arguments of different kinds, analyze, evaluate, and produce explanation, analyze, evaluate, and make decisions, draw inferences, and produce arguments. Of course, there are other thinking skills you might wish to develop, but these are good place to start. Some instructive examples. Let us ask some further questions to see whether you have a reasonable grasp of what have been said so far. So, question number 1.6. Do the following activities involve critical thinking as you understand? You are reading a novel for pleasure. No. You are solving a routine mathematical problem in a standard, well learned systematic way that requires you to reason your way through a conclusion. Think of an example and discuss with your friend that reference to it. Okay, if the problem is well defined and the structure is well defined, then I don't think we need a critical thinking. A professional basketball player is playing in an important match. Critical thinking is necessary, I think, for this. So, what was critical thinking according to our latest definition? Thinking about any subject, content, or problem in which thinker improves its quality of thinking and skillfully taking charge and structure inherent in thinking. And reasonable and reflective thinking that is focused. Critical thinking is involved. You have just completed your GCSE exam and you are now trying to decide which A level subjects to do. This also requires critical thinking. You have attempted to install some new software on your computer, but it is not working properly. So now you are trying to follow the instruction for troubleshooting. I don't think this requires critical thinking. Now, question number 1.7. Imagine someone, let us call him Andy, standing beside a used car, trying to decide whether to buy it. Okay, imagine someone, let us call him Andy, standing beside a used car, trying to decide whether to buy it. Andy does not have much money and he does not know how much about cars, but he has just left college and have been offered a new job which requires him to have a reliable car. A salesperson told Andy all the advantages of the car in question and has offered a bargain price. Case 1. Let us suppose that Andy had come to like the trust the salesperson in the course of talking about the car, though they had never met before, and Andy knows nothing of the company for which she works, and he likes the look of the car, so decides to buy it. Case 2. Let us suppose that Andy comes to like the salesperson but treats what she says with caution. Get an expert mechanic to check the vehicle over, checks prices of comparable vehicles in a used car price guide, and gets a knowledgeable friend to advise on negotiation of price. The question now has three parts. 1.7.1. Look at Devi's definition above and decide whether Andy displays reflective thinking according to the definition. Okay, is he active, persistent, and careful? In case 2, yes. Referring to Glazer's list of abilities, does Andy recognize what is the problem, find workable means for dealing the problem, and gather marshal pertinent information, recognize unstated assumptions and values? Or would you say that Andy acts reasonably in either case? He acts reasonably in second case because he is taking precaution and gets expert mechanic, checks prices, compare it, and take help of his friends, and then makes a decision. So that one is better, I think. So now we have question 1.8. In this case, two friends, Bertha and Cheryl, are watching an American TV program on 1991 Gulf War. The presenter, who is American, comments on the pinpoint accuracy of the US weapons. Okay, why am I reading this book here? Because I'm showing commitment that okay, if I have to upload something worthwhile every day or just talking about myself, communicating wholly in English, it would be better for me. And while I'm not making videos, I'm not much committed and motivated enough to read these books and take out time. Okay, so that is why I'm reading these books here. Noted. TV program on Gulf War. The presenter, who is American, comments on the pinpoint accuracy of the US weapons and says that the film shows heat-seeking missiles going down the chimneys of buildings and to blow them up, and ground-based US Patriot missiles. Okay, I'm feeling very sleepy. Not interested in reading question number 1.8. We'll do it in next session. This is the book Critical Thinking by Alec Fisher. Okay, so talking about today, what all did I do today? I woke up at around 10 in the morning. Then I had some engagements online, then I finished them, talked to my brother and my parents for around 1.5 hours in so many days, had some nice chit chat, I enjoyed it. Then I had my lunch, slept for some time because, oh, before that we had a class, macroeconomics class from 2 to 3. Then I slept for some time, and I also didn't go to basketball today because I was not feeling well. And after waking up, I had my dinner, read this critical thinking book, and also did some research for something that I am thinking. So stay tuned and wait for that. That was all for today. Good night. Jai Hind.